Hey, folks, it's Nate. It's time I got back to the drawing board, and tonight we're back with another episode of Book Club, Manga in Theory and Practice, Chapter 6. I do other stuff on this channel from time to time, but right now this is kind of all I have time for, so hopefully you're enjoying this. These videos usually do fairly well, so it seems that you are. Anyways, if you want to pull out your book and read along, be my guest. Otherwise, let's just dive into it. Araki has been covering the 4 fundamentals of manga, and today, chapter 6 is setting. Setting is something that everyone, I think, kind of thinks about, but really doesn't think about as a part of storytelling. They just think of it as the background, which is what a setting is. But Araki talks about many things that make the setting a vitally important thing to consider as part of your manga. He says worlds built within manga are different from our own, and readers want to immerse themselves within those worlds. And that is the basic theme of this chapter. It's not so much about world building as it is about immersion, which is, a concept you hear a lot about in Western storytelling as well. The importance of maintaining suspension of disbelief, keeping people immersed, creating verisimilitude. These are all ideas that are very common in Western storytelling as well. But Araki kind of looks at it from this very manga-based perspective. He says, a manga creator's foremost concern is that of creating characters. Readers are primarily motivated by the desire to be immersed in that creator's worlds. So he's thinking of it as an aspect that is particularly important to the audience. And of course, your audience is something you have to be very attentive to whenever you're creating any kind of media. So setting for a manga is the part that is probably going to connect the most with your audience. And you see this a lot, from cosplayers to fan communities to role-playing and other kinds of simulation games, all very common. So what does he have to say about this? Readers want to be immersed. He says, a setting is an alternate reality, and as such, it must be grounded in realism. If you create a world haphazardly, the readers won't achieve immersion and will likely lose interest in reading your manga. Even if the world is fanciful, the setting must exist as a whole, unstructured entity within the mangaka's mind, and it must have an inner logic. Only then will readers become absorbed in the events that unfold within that world. And this is very true. If you've ever heard anyone talk about The Lord of the Rings, or a similar fantasy series that has tons of really in-depth world building behind it, it is very true that the audience really loves that stuff. If you look at the number of people who have learned Elvish or Klingon or things like that, parts of fantasy or science fiction worlds that you never see in their entirety. You never hear someone explain a Klingon lexicon or Elvish grammar, but it all existed, and it existed because people were very passionate about building these things and structuring them before they started telling stories in these worlds. And even though you may be just a 1 or 2 or 4-man writing and art team, you really need to get all of these details squared away before you really dig into telling your story. He gives an example of this from a manga that he wrote called Bao the Visitor, which was one of Araki's early works. And in this, he talks about Bao being introduced on a train that runs along a very specific part of the Japanese coastline, and he drew all the details of the train wrong. It was a double line that he drew, whereas in reality it was a single line. The trains in his story were electrical, while in reality they're diesel powered. And he just lost readers because they saw these details and they were taken out of the story, and they wrote him letters complaining, and they just never got back into it. And that's a bad thing. If you are basing some part of your story in reality, you better get that part of reality down cold. Likewise, if some part of human psychology is important to your story, really dig into that part of human psychology. Make sure you understand all of its facets, not just the ones that are important to your story, so you can more realistically and faithfully depict the minor details that might not be relevant to your main point, will still make you look silly if somebody who knows more about the subject than your average Joe is reading your story. He talks about only a master can rely on mood. Setting is part of what sets the mood, but his point is kind of you can't rely entirely on that. Some kinds of manga get away with that. He gives the example of Akira Toriyama has a very mood-based storytelling, that kind of high adventure and seeking out challenges and all that other kind of stuff. A lot of shoujo focuses on that's romance is written for young girls, tends to focus on mood, but by and large, setting will not carry your story, even though it may be one of the most important parts to your audience. You need characters and you need plot, and you need art before you need setting. It's not to say it's not unimportant. I mean, these are like the legs of a table. If you take one out, you're going to be in a bad place. You can build a 3-legged table. You can build even a 2-legged table or a 1-legged table. They exist, but it requires a lot of extra work and planning to make those properly. Moving on, he says, be thorough in your research. When you're creating a fictional world, he says, to put it in terms of Star Wars, you need to know what's going on inside the Death Star. In other words, in order to convey a setting, every image down to an unassuming landscape requires research into every detail. Sometimes your answers will come from the needs of your manga. Let's say you've decided to draw a train. You shouldn't just draw any train. There must be a reason you're drawing one in that picture. What kind of a train does it need to be to fit that reason? At the same time, as before, if you're drawing a train in a specific place, you better know about that place, and so on and so forth. So you're drawing a hospital, Araki says. Know what else is in the building behind the waiting and examination rooms will lead you to create an authentic setting. If you don't have a layout for your buildings, well, maybe you should at least sketch one up. You don't need to put it, as a page in your comic. That would actually kind of be pretty dull. I'm not a huge fan of stories that interrupt themselves to show a map, unless it's like a mission briefing that involves a map. You can get away with that, but otherwise, you don't really need to put that stuff in. So he has a bunch of bullet points for how to create a setting. These are much like his other bullet points. He recommends a bunch of things and emphasizes that there can be more even above and beyond this, depending on what kind of setting you're trying to create. Topography and guidebooks may not be necessary as part of your setting if, say, everybody is stuck in a cursed school building or in a graveyard or even in a single room. If you're doing something like 12 Angry Men, although why you would do that as a comic, I don't know. Anyways, point is, research all that kind of stuff. When drawing a sport, make sure you know the rules and the history and the uniforms and all that kind of stuff. When you draw a sushi chef, know something about sushi and how sushi chefs get their ingredients and about the kinds of fish they use and so on and so forth. He also emphasizes some things can't be researched online. You have to go places and do things. Quite often, Araki says, you will find that a location is different in person than you had imagined it would be. If you've ever looked around for an apartment or shopped for a house, you know how true that is. Those photos are very deceptive. This is also true of cities. I recently, this year, I made a trip overseas to a different country, and I saw a lot of pictures in guidebooks, and I've seen pictures on the news, and of course, you can just Google those cities and see pictures. It's very different in person. For starters, those pictures tend to somehow be taken when there are no people around. There's always a lot of people around in most cities. Really, if you're talking about specific real-world places that you've never been to, you definitely want to go there and not only get a feel for what they look like and what the space is like, but the kinds of people that are there, that kind of thing. One of the interesting things he brings up is the sense of distance in Japan versus the American Midwest. In JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, the 7th installment, story arc, whatever you want to call it, that was called Steel Ball Run. It takes place in a race on horseback across the United States in the late 1800s. And America was a very different place then and even now as compared to Japan. He says, Araki says, without going there for yourself, it's impossible to comprehend the feeling of scale in the Midwestern United States, where the scenery stretches forever and unchanging. The feeling of distance there is nothing like in Japan. I mean, if you've ever been to the deserts of Arizona or, places like Iowa or even Ohio or Indiana, where it's very flat for large stretches of distance and you just feel like you can see for miles. It's very true. I've never been to Japan, of course, but I have been to some other countries that are, fairly mountainous, and there is a very different sense of distance in these very flat expanses like the deserts of Arizona and Nevada, or the flatlands of Ohio or Iowa. So he talks a bit about that and how it inspired him, this sense of isolation at the same time being able to see everything. One of the interesting things he says, if you see an enemy coming, you will see him coming hours and hours away, and that's a great way to build tension, because you know that he's there, but you can't get to him, or he can't get to you, or if you're running away, he's closing the distance excruciatingly slowly. Yeah, man, what a tool for suspense. And Araki does make great use of it at times in Steel Ball Run, if you've never read that. So to conclude with that, he says, Araki says, if you can't find time to do this kind of research, or even to watch movies or read books or other activities to help find ideas, you'll wither as a mangaka. You really do need to get away from the drawing board every so often. I know I come back to it every time I make one of these videos, and I spend a lot of time there outside of making videos, but I also try and get out and do stuff on a regular basis. I'm an introvert. I don't always like it, but it is important to get those ideas. Araki can afford to travel all over the place. If you can't afford to travel all over the place, at least try and, subscribe to Netflix and watch some travel documentaries or something. Don't draw everything you research is the heading of the next section. It's a very good thing to keep in mind. You learn this as both a writer and an artist, I think. People don't need to know how the pie is made a lot of the time. So really rein in on your tendency to overshare. This is one area where editors and beta readers are incredibly helpful, because if you cut too much, they are a lot more likely to tell you than if you overshare. If you say too much and they get bored, they're probably not going to think to make a note of it. But if you don't say enough and they're confused, they will definitely make a note of it. Err towards cutting information, especially on details and background research. So after the setting is complete, Araki says the setting becomes a world in which the readers want to become immersed, but it is also a world in which the creator wants to become immersed. When a manga primarily focuses on its setting, I believe that is because the creator deeply wants to be immersed in that world. But the problem faced by setting-focused manga is that once that setting is fully fleshed out, the creator's desires are satisfied. And then the creator kind of gets bored. This is known as George R.R. Martin syndrome. Excuse me. His point is, try not to ever be done with creating a setting. Try and keep it unfolding. Don't try and perfect a setting, because once you do, you're probably going to want to move on. And worse than that, he also says the more magnificent the completed setting, the harder it is to land upon a setting that can surpass or even match it. Akira's setting was so masterfully created that I still don't think it has been bested to this day. And that's very true. Everyone hits a high water mark. There is such a thing as peaking too early. And you probably don't want to peak until, the last thing you publish. And I don't know if that's really a thing we have to, most of us have to panic about. I think a lot of us are always going to be dissatisfied with our work and trying to improve upon it. But we also have to be aware of what the audience sees. The setting is one of the most important parts to the audience, especially if you want to make a long-lasting work that goes on, which is, again, primarily what Araki is addressing, because he is writing to manga artists, and that's what manga publishers want. They don't want one-and-done one-shots or short, intense stories. They want really long, ongoing stuff, by and large. And, for that, you really need to keep your setting going. A really masterful writer for this, if you've ever read Ichiro Oda, the author and artist of One Piece, man, his setting just keeps unfolding like some kind of crazy reverse nesting Russian nesting dolls. It's crazy, absolutely absurd. Great setting writing there. So he also points out that if you want to further develop an already completed setting, using new characters may help you succeed. And of course, characters are always capable of inner growth. They keep on growing, never reach a completed state. So, yeah, you can do things once your setting is done. And if setting is not your primary driving factor, you can dig into those characters. You can dig into, character growth, character progression, new characters, and they can all keep your stories fresh and interesting as they unfold. So just keep in mind, setting is a big thing to your audience, and you really need a good, solid, well-built setting. And that's pretty much all I had to say about it. It's one of his shorter chapters. It's kind of a nebulous concept, to be perfectly honest. World building is a thing which fascinates a lot of writers, especially if they're into science fiction or fantasy. And it's something that fascinates the audiences as well. Just look at Matt Pat and his game theory and film theory channels. Massively popular, and all he does is think about really the settings of the video games and movies. And it's almost a bottomless well of interesting and engaging potential. It is important not to get too caught up in it. It's also important to make sure there's enough there for your audience to really grab onto and take an interest in. So, really, really interesting chapter. I think I would have liked Araki to talk a little bit more about it. Based on the stories he's told, Araki is very much a fan of real life settings with these supernatural or fantastical elements added to them. If you've read or watched JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 4, Diamond is Unbreakable, you know that Moriacho, where that part of the story is set, is based almost entirely on a town where Araki lived. And he very faithfully recreates the feel of a real living, breathing town. So I think that his approach is more to just get into a place and really get to know it. And maybe that's not as useful to a science fiction or a fantasy writer, but it is definitely a good approach. And if you're doing something even as reality-based as, say, noir or horror or Cthulhu fiction, cosmic horror type stuff, taking that approach can really help you to build out your setting and make something that feels real and authentic, but still has that really crazy, weird edge to it. And while it's true that not every comic has to be crazy and weird, I mean, let's face it, this is an illustrated medium. It gives you the greatest potential for crazy and weird visuals of anything. So maybe you want that a little bit. I would say you do. Anyways, that's all I got for you tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've read this, please do share your thoughts on building settings in the comment box down below. There's a like button and a subscribe button there too. Use them as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.